Mercenaries are extremely common in fantasy settings, whether it be a rugged individual adventurer looking to make some coin, or a large company of professional warriors. This isn't without good reason. Historically, mercenaries were also extremely common, and many ancient and medieval states relied heavily on them because professional armies were rare until the last few centuries. But if mercenaries are common in fantasy and in history, then where are they in Tolkien's universe? In this video, let's talk about mercenaries in Middle-earth. Did they exist? And if so, what form did they appear in? Okay, so the simple definition of mercenaries are soldiers for hire. They're not loyal to any state, they're not loyal to any ideology, they're basically just loyal to gold or whatever other reward they are fighting for. The general idea behind recruiting mercenaries was that they were better trained fighters who could fill gaps in the main army. They were sometimes more expendable because they were often foreign, and they could usually be relied upon not to take part in eternal disputes as long as they were being paid. Results varied. Some rulers suffered greatly because they put their faith and coin in the wrong mercenaries. Now, as far as we're aware, nothing in Middle-earth perfectly fits this description. There's certainly no mention of specific mercenary companies, nor do we really meet any characters who operated as traditional mercenaries. The main reason for this is that Middle-earth was a very polarized place where the stakes were much higher. It was a battle between good and evil. In actual history, mercenaries didn't need to fight until the bitter end. If they were on the losing side of the war, they could simply cut their losses, leave, and go serve somewhere else, or they could even switch sides. But in Middle-earth, it just isn't the same. If you're in a land that isn't controlled by Sauron, refusing to fight against him because you're not being paid enough doesn't make sense. You can't just walk away or opt out, because Sauron is going to come for your land eventually, and you're going to be killed or enslaved as well. Likewise, if you're in a land already aligned with Sauron, well, sorry, you don't have a choice, you're fighting for the Dark Lord whether you like it or not. On both sides of the spectrum, there's just much less room to maneuver. That said, there were some grey areas in which some groups or individuals did sort of operate as mercenaries, although they still weren't exactly traditional mercenaries. The first example is in regards to the Northmen of Rhinous. From the 1240s onward, they were reliable allies of Gondor until their destruction at the hands of the Wainriders in 1856. But before the 1240s, the Northmen of Rhinous were a collection of rival princes who would sometimes even fight each other. Sometimes, some groups of Northmen would actually ally with the neighbouring Easterlings if it meant getting an advantage over rival Northman factions. But not all of the fighting was for political or ideological reasons. Some of the Northmen actually sided with the Easterlings for promise of loot, and together they would raid fellow Northmen or even Gondorian territory. This actually prompted Gondorian intervention, because Romendikil II, future king of Gondor, recognised the usefulness of the Northmen and did not wish for them to side with the Easterlings under any circumstances. He defeated the Easterlings and ended up bringing the Northmen solidly under Gondor's sphere of influence. Some Northmen siding with the Easterlings perfectly represents the grey area that could sometimes manifest. The Northmen and the Easterlings were historical enemies, and in the end, the Wainrider Easterlings would conquer Rhinous, and the Balkoff Easterlings would later destroy any Northmen who remained there. But when there was no threat of imminent destruction, helped by the fact that Sauron wasn't so active at this time, some Northmen were willing to cross ideological boundaries to side with some of the Easterlings. Even though the Northmen were mostly associated with good and the Easterlings mostly associated with evil, the lure of gold and loot was a strong enough lure for some of the Northmen. There's one other possible example of a group being motivated to fight due to gold rather than ideology or political reasons. A possible example because it's certainly not confirmed. This is in regards to the Eastern Dwarves, some of whom were aligned with Morgoth, allied with Orcs, and even fought for Sauron during the War of the Last Alliance. However, any Dwarven association with the forces of evil seems to have ended in the Third Age, which means that the Dwarves may have been paid to fight against the forces of good. This would fit with Dwarven characteristics, being motivated to fight by greed rather than politics. Alternatively, this could have just been a corrupted faction of Dwarves who were either redeemed or later destroyed. The next examples I want to talk about also aren't examples of traditional mercenaries. Instead, they're better defined as auxiliaries. This term originated with the Roman Empire. Tribal groups who weren't Roman citizens would serve with the Roman military, often in roles suited to their specialization: cavalry, skirmishers, archers, etc. Of course, auxiliaries did fight for gold, but they also fought for political reasons and for the attainment of new statuses, such as that of a Roman citizen. The Númenóreans and later the Gondorians also made use of auxiliaries. In regards to the Númenóreans, their military actually used very little cavalry, and they preferred to fight on foot as heavy infantry or long-range archers. They mostly only used cavalry as scouts and couriers, and in combat they only used them as lightly armed horse archers. However, lightly armed and Númenóreans don't go together, so these horse archers were mostly of non-Númenórean origin, so probably from the men of Eriador, the pre-Númenóreans, or even from the Northmen. The Gondorians continued with this tradition, having very little of their own cavalry, such as the Swan Knights of Dol Amroth. Instead, most of Gondor's cavalry came from the Northmen of Rhovanion, and while many of them served as allied forces, some also came to Gondor and served in Gondor's military, sometimes attaining positions of high rank and later settling in Gondor. This continued for centuries, only ending when Rhovanion was conquered by the Wainriders. While this did have a positive effect on Gondor militarily, it did have some unfortunate consequences. The mixing with the Northmen hastened Gondor's decline somewhat, and it was a contributing factor to the Kinstrife Civil War. Our final example is individuals who left their country to serve abroad. Once again, they weren't traditional mercenaries because ideology was usually more important than any other reward. Our first example is during the First Age. Even before the Edain were given lands alongside Noldoran princes, some individual Edain ended up in their service, such as Beor, who served King Finrod Felagund, and Amlak, who served under Maedhros in Himring, after a shapeshifter impersonated him in an effort to sow discontent between men and elves. Another example is thousands of years later, at the end of the Third Age. Steward Ecthelion II, father of Denethor II, put out a call to all men of worth near and far to enter his service against Mordor, giving rank and reward to those who proved trustworthy. We don't know how many answered the call, and of that number, we only know the identity of one, Thorongil, who was actually Aragorn in disguise. Aragorn ended up becoming one of Ecthelion's most trusted advisors and led a surprise attack on Umbar which crippled the Corsair fleet for several decades. Before Aragorn, Thengel of Rohan, Theoden's father, also went to Gondor and served under Steward Turgon, Ecthelion's father, where he also won great renown. So there we have it. While traditional mercenary companies don't seem to have existed, there were people who fought for foreign powers for a number of different reasons. The Northmen sometimes fought alongside the Easterlings for loot, some dwarves may have served Sauron for gold, foreign men took service in the armies of Númenor and Gondor for land and reward, and individual men sometimes took up service in the lands of greater lords to win renown. So if you were an adventuring person, you could sell your sword to someone. Probably not to a mercenary company, but to a land or ruler, and provided you proved yourself worthy and trustworthy, you could win something for yourself. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I wanted to include this as part of a video which talked about some popular fantastical or historical tropes that actually don't really appear much in Tolkien's world, such as mercenaries, adventurers, pirates, and travelling merchants. In the end, I figured that Mercenaries, at the very least, could have a video of its own. I may cover the others later. Cheers, farewell, and remember, mercenaries still exist today, and they win much renown committing war crimes in places like Africa.